Welcome to a very scary edition of Book Turned Movie. And I mean that in the most literal sense, as today's topic is Scary Godmother. If you grew up in the mid-2000s, then you'd be very familiar with this movie as it was a staple of Cartoon Network's Halloween lineup. And if you haven't, then this should be a great introduction to a very solid Halloween special. Speaking of which, that's actually a bit of an issue with this video, because technically, Scary Godmother isn't really a movie. The runtime is around 45 minutes, so it's more of a TV special than a film, but it's listed as a made-for-TV movie, and I will count it as such. Besides, I've actually wanted to talk about this series for years. Because of its association with Cartoon Network, I ended up catching it every single Halloween. And after rewatching it in preparation for this video, I still think it holds up great 2 decades later. Well, kind of. Scary Godmother stars a little girl named Hannah, who goes trick-or-treating with her cousin and his friends. They believe that taking Hannah with them is going to slow them down, so they devise a plan to make her run home scared. They take her to an abandoned house and lock her inside, which has quite thoroughly traumatized this little girl. But as it turns out, her fear ends up attracting the attention of her own very scary godmother. And she's here to help Hannah overcome her own fears. And so she invites Hannah to join her for a Halloween party in her realm. There, Hannah meets an assortment of spooky monsters. And although they scare her at first, some more than others, Hannah eventually grows very fond of them. Before the night is over, Hannah's new friends decide to help her with one final Halloween trick. They get back at the older kids for scaring her, and they make Hannah look like a brave hero saving them. As Halloween comes to an end, Hannah says goodbye to her scary godmother. However, she gives Hannah a skeleton key, telling her she can visit her anytime she's up for a good scare. It's a very short and straightforward plot, but for a 45-minute special, you'd expect that. Earlier, I hinted at the movie might not have held up in some regards, and by now it's pretty obvious I was referring to the film's animation. Though that goes without saying for a made-to-TV Halloween special. They don't always get the highest budgets. That being said though, I usually do have some positive notes for the animation as well as the movie itself. But first, we gotta talk about the story that inspired the movie. The Scary Godmother series of books was created by Jill Thompson. And yes, I did say series of books. As far as I have seen, there are 6 books in total, spanning from 1997 to 2002, which is just 1 year before the movie released in 2003. This is important to note because while the movie is an adaptation of the first book, it also uses several attempts from the other books. And as far as the plot goes, the first book is near identical to the films. The story stars a little girl named Hannah who goes trick-or-treating with her cousin and his friends. They devise a plan to ditch her at an abandoned house, traumatize her, and then her scary godmother appears to help her conquer her fears. After introducing her to some monsters, they decide to help Hannah get payback for what they did. All's well that ends well. It's short and sweet, although there should be a bigger emphasis on the short descriptor. You probably noticed it, but there is one little plot element from the movie that I completely skipped here. The Halloween party. That was never in the first book, but rather, this plot element comes from the third book. And from here, the differences really start to pile up. In the movie, we are introduced to a variety of spooky monsters. However, in the first book, we are only introduced to 2 of them, not including Scary Godmother herself. Some monsters from the film would be introduced in the second book, and some don't even get lines of dialogue until late in the series. We even see some monsters who didn't make the cut for the film, but regardless of how many got introduced, these 3 would stay as the main characters for the books. Speaking of the monsters, one important bit of lore from the movie is that the monsters live in their own realm, the spook side, and they can travel freely between the human realm and their own. However, this concept wasn't introduced until the second book, so the first book takes place entirely at the abandoned house. The movie ends with Scary Godmother giving Hannah a skeleton key so that she can visit the spook side at any time. But in the book, Hannah doesn't need a key. Instead, she can go there whenever she wants just by saying a special phrase. While there is tons more differences, these ones are really just the important ones. Like in the movie, the werewolf orders too much pizza than they can afford, which is a plot point from the later book. And in the movie, the vampires have a marital dispute, which is from another book. In the movie, the skeleton monster is seemingly a sly joke. He's referred to as a skeleton in the closet. Being given a very flamboyant voice as well, it's something the book never really alluded to, so you might just think it's a silly quirk given to the character after the fact. But no, one of the books almost flat out confirms that the skeleton's gay when one of the characters questions why he was allowed in a girls-only tea party. Truth be told, I just really wanted to point that out because I don't think anyone knows that the books actually confirmed it, even if the intention was obvious right off the bat. Another thing I'd like to touch on is the most obvious reason why the movie hasn't aged the greatest, that low-budget, early 2000s CG animation. That jank was noticeable back then, and that's especially the case now. But despite how rough it can look, I think they made some very good decisions that have helped it hold up better. The original book's drawings were very messy and chaotic, very reminiscent of the style of Tim Burton. It's a very good look for the series, and obviously it would be hard to replicate in CG. However, I think they did a very good job with it. The character models look near identical to the book counterparts, and while they're very low quality still, this stylized look definitely has done the movie some favors. Another cool thing is the backgrounds of the films are actually drawings, which I think is pretty clever, not only helping the film age better, but by also giving the movie a pop-up book-like aesthetic. And this was a very good choice on their part, especially using some art from the original book. But all of this begs the question, which of these is the better version? Obviously, in terms of art, the book is far superior, but in terms of the story, it's actually not as cut and dry of a case. The movie had the foresight of being made several years later after the book series began, so it was able to flesh out the story with continuity from the previous books. Naturally, this would mean that the movie has greatly improved past what the first book had done. However, I think this ended up causing more problems than it fixed. The original story was short and sweet, and technically, so was the film. But the problem is that they needed to stretch the original story into a 50-minute runtime. Their way of doing this was the addition of the Halloween party, and as well as all the characters introduced during it. Because of this, the film was padded out, for better and for worse. One of the worst ways this film was padded was with the long, drawn-out scenes, like Hannah freaking out at the graveyard for 30 seconds, or a monster chase scene for a minute, or this wolf guy monologuing for a minute. Like, it adds up, and it's all pretty exhausting. However, the other way this movie pads out its runtime is with the lengthy character back and forths. And in a way, this is by far the movie's best quality. Its animation is subpar, its story is simple, but they absolutely nail the character writing. Between Hannah growing closer to the monsters, or to the monsters arguing like roommates, to the vampires' marital disputes, and to the older kids trying to rationalize the situation they're in. If there's any reason you'd return to this special, it's the characters. And the thing is, the characters really aren't that different from how they're portrayed in the books. The only reason the movie has a step up in this regard is because the original book lacked a lot of this content. Most of the characters, as well as their personalities, weren't really touched on till a few books in. So, in terms of a complete deal, I would have to say the movie is better than the book. But if we were to include the entire book series, then that would obviously be the decisive winner. But regardless, both are an absolute staple of Halloween. And to end this video on a high note, it might not be the last we see of scary Godmother. The author has been saying for years that she's working towards an animated series based on the books, and as of 2020, she was still certain of it happening. So it'll be interesting to see how the show will look after 2 decades of technological advancements. But I think that's all I have to say on this topic. If you'd like to see more videos like this, where I discuss the source material of some animated films, then be sure to let me know in the comments. Also, subscribing would really help support the content we make. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.